Hello, and welcome back to the NNP Symposium. For this session, we are joined by me. I am part of the group running the symposium, but I am also a collector myself. And so I'll be talking about Keicho Ichibu, which is a series I have been researching for a while, and it'll be a good time. So like always, if you have any questions, you can send them into the Q&A at any time, and I'll talk about them at the end. But we're gonna get right into it. There we go. Okay, so here are some Keicho Ichibu. We'll learn a lot more about them by the end. Okay, so first of all, what is Japanese bar money? If you have ever seen any examples of Japanese bar money, it's probably one of these four types. These are denomination-wise: 1 shu, 2 shu, 1 bu, and 2 bu. These are the most common types. You can see them, or you can find them fairly often in the US. If you've seen any, it's gonna be these. However, the actual heart of the series, the piece or the type that led to all of these, was none of them. It is the gold 1 bu or Ichibu. These ran from 1599 all the way through 1869, which was the end of the series. None of these other types ran for that long. They were all introduced later on and were supplementary to the gold Ichibu. So we're going to be talking about one of the early types of Ichibu. And just for the record, the characters here in the center of this coin are the denomination. The line over here is Ichi, meaning 1, and this is the character for Bu. So these are the different types of gold Ichibu. So for Japanese bar money, it is not dated. There is no kind of date on the coin. You are never going to be able to sit down and say, this is from 1632. It's not going to happen. They are dated in ranges of dates. So all of the pieces minted within the 94 years of 1601 to 1695 are grouped under the same umbrella of Keicho. We will get a little bit more specific with the dates a little later on, but for pretty much all of the other pieces, it's just all of these 80 some years, those are Genbun. It's all one type, and you can't break it down any further. So as you can see here, Keicho were minted for the longest. They were only the second type. The first one was the Gaku Ichibu. It was only made for 1 year. And I did do a presentation on the Gaku Ichibu a couple years ago, if you caught that one. If you didn't, no worries. We don't need that background information to understand what's happening today. So the Keicho were the second ones. They started in 1601 and went all the way through 1695. So if you are researching Keicho Ichibu using published books, these are going to be your best bets for English references. These are your best bets for any Japanese bar money in English. There's Vermeil Jacobs, which was published in 1952. This covers the 2009 reprint, but it was from 52. In 2011, there's Early Japanese Coins by David Hartill. Personally, this one is usually my favorite reference. If you're going to buy one book, I would recommend Hartill. And most recently, we have the Standard Catalog of Japanese Coins from 2021. So let's see what all of these books have to say about Keicho Ichibu. This is Vermeil Jacobs. So this is just an illustration showing generally what gold Ichibu look like, because they are all extremely similar. So this is just kind of a stock image for gold Ichibu. And then this is showing us how to differentiate two specific types. So what Vermeil Jacobs is saying here, without key era designator, with very few exceptions, almost all gold Ichibu have an extra character in the top right-hand corner. Keicho is one of the types that does not. That's what it's saying. The ones under this heading do not have that era designator. So you can identify the Keicho by the fact that there is no character in that corner. However, Kyoho is another type that was minted later on that also does not have an era designator. And so here we're saying you can just tell between those two types because on Keicho Ichibu line, the Ichi character goes through the border of dots, whereas on Kyoho Ichibu, it does not. There's a space between them. Great. There's only one type of Keicho Ichibu. We're done. End of presentation, right? No, not at all. Because when you look at Hartill, all of these are different types of Keicho Ichibu. The first two lines here are just giving us, the name, the weight, some general stats. And then we get into different types. And so what Hartel is saying here with the way that these are broken down is that there are three main types of Keicho Ichibu. One's from the Edo Mint, the Kyoto Mint, and the Suruga Mint. And these are distinguished by their reverse variety. Now, a side note, no one can agree on what is the obverse and what is the reverse for this entire series. There's any book that you look at, it's going to take a different position. So don't put too much stock in the fact that we're saying here reverse is this side. Later, I'll be calling that the obverse. Just, it's fine. It's a whole different conversation as far as which one should be the obverse versus reverse. The point is that the different mint locations are distinguished by this side and the calligraphy styles on it. So we have these three pictures trying to show us what the different styles are. I don't know about you, but when I first started looking at these coins, I could not for the life of me figure out what the objective differences are between these three. Especially when I started looking at the coins themselves, there is a wild amount of variation in the style of these coins, which you'll see some of later on. And so there was no commentary telling me what the parts of these are that I was supposed to be looking at. You know, is this like half circle with a dot? Is that something I should be paying attention to? Or how this part here is really tall and then here it's short and fat? What is the significant part of the differences here? Did not tell me that. And then it goes on to say that the following varieties of these are found. So we have old cast, which in Japanese, cast is not used like we use cast. These coins were struck, not cast. This is just meaning like old mintage. They were the old ones. And so these have no character on the top right, which we'll get back to in a second. And the Ichi character passes through the dots on the right, like seen here, which is the same thing that Vermeil Jacob said. On Keicho, it passes through the dots. Great. We're in agreement on something. It doesn't specify what the Ichi does on any other type. But we can assume, based on Vermeil Jacobs, that it always goes through the dots for Keicho. And then we also have these two, which here are translated as hen character, top right, and then Rio character, top right. So those are these two illustrations. My own Zoom window is in my way. So here we have one character in the top right-hand corner. This one has a character in the left as well, which is not what it describes, but that's fine. We can see that there are two characters. It seems to be the same character. I could not tell you what that character is. That looks nothing like any Japanese character I have ever seen in my life. And I do not speak Japanese, but I have done a lot of translating Japanese. I have interacted with a lot of Japanese characters at this point. That does not look like Japanese to me. So I had no idea what this was trying to be. So that's what we got from Hartel. I had a lot of questions at this point as far as what are the significant varieties here? Which ones do people actually care about? You know, would a full set mean having one of each of the mints? Or do you need one of each of the mints and an old cast and the hen and the Rio? Do they come in all combinations of these? I had so many questions about what was happening with this group of coins after looking at Hartel. So let's look at the last English reference. This one is the most recently published, and I did not have access to this book at the time that I started researching Keicho Ichibu. I don't know if it was just not out yet or if I just hadn't purchased a copy. The point is I didn't have access to it at the time, but let's take a look. So we have, pictures and basic background info. And so here we're breaking it up into common, old type, single hone, double hone. And then this last one, upside down, that just means one that was struck in coin alignment instead of metal alignment. That happens for all of the gold pieces in the series. That was really no question. That's very common throughout the series. Have encountered that before. It's fine. These, I don't know. That's what the question is, because here, the only mention that we're making of the different mint locations the ones that in Hartill were the main distinctions, are down here. Just as a side note, we're not saying anything about how to distinguish them, just that they were minted there. This page doesn't even tell me that they are distinguishable based on the coins. Instead, we're focusing on old type and the two single or double hone varieties. So here we have old type means the ichi ends before the dotted border, which, first of all, is the exact opposite of what Hartill said. And second of all, based on Vermeil-Jacobs, if the ichi is disconnected from the dots, that means it's entirely a different type. Vermeil-Jacobs said that that is a Kyoho Ichibu, not Keicho. So I'm at a loss. The common type is where it extends into the border. Okay. I think it's probably for the best that I didn't have access to this book when I first started researching, because I would have just been even more confused. It does go on to show the two hone varieties. We have a single hone, has this still very weird character in the top right, and then double hone has them in both corners. Doesn't tell me anything about what those characters mean or the significance, but all right, that does agree with what Hartill characterized as the Ren and Rio varieties. Going forward, I will be referring to these as single hone and double hone. Those are the most accurate names that I have come across. So we are continuing with that. And I do just want to point out on this drawing of the old type versus the common, everything except the ichi in the border here is the exact same, including the number of dots going around the top. Just hang on to that. So this is the Japanese version of the Red Book. It's called the JNDA. It's generally pretty good, but it is very Japanese. So here we have old cast and normal type. That's what that's saying. And this illustration lines up pretty well with the standard catalog we just looked at. On old type, the ichi is separated from the dots, and on standard, it goes into the dots. Great. It also goes on to show the old cast signature, somehow implying that this side with the calligraphy is also different on the old type. Again, there's no annotation showing me what part I'm supposed to be looking at, but it's there. I really wanted them to describe these pictures and they didn't. So that's where we are. And then again, we break it down into the single hone and double hone. Those illustrations line up with what we saw before. We're doing good. Over here, we have the value table where they break down the major types and give values for each of them. And here we break it down into Edo mint in coin alignment, Kyoto mint, Kyoto coin aligned, Suruga mint, Suruga coin aligned, and then old cast, single hone, double hone. Again, it doesn't say anything about how to distinguish between the different mints. It doesn't say if you can find a Kyoto mint that's also a single hone or an Edo mint that's also an old cast. So many questions I still had after going through all of these books. So I spent about 2 years researching this grouping on and off. And by last spring was pretty content that I had found everything I was going to find. And the questions that I still had were just going to have to remain questions. So I actually put this PowerPoint together last spring. It was ready to go. If we had anyone drop out during the spring symposium last minute, I was going to fill in. We were good. That didn't happen. Very glad. So I signed up for this one, and here we are. It was all done. We were good till Tuesday. A friend of mine on Tuesday came across this book, a study of Keicho Koban and Ichibu. Koban are a type of coin that were minted right alongside Ichibu. And part of the reason I think that specifically Keicho Ichibu, but a lot of other types as well, are not very clearly documented is because most people tend to focus on the Koban. Koban were larger ovals that were gold. They're pretty, you've likely seen one before. They're much more widely known than the Ichibu. And so most people who are collecting this series are going to focus on the higher value pieces, which are the Koban, meaning the gold Ichibu are just kind of a side note. that we don't spend too much time on, which I think is part of why it's so under-researched. But the point is, this book exists, which is entirely focused on Keicho gold coinage. I can't read Japanese. I can pick out individual words, like I can read most of this title, but I cannot just sit down with a book and read through it in 3 days. That's entirely in Japanese. So I have done my best to get through this book and pick out the parts that looked significant and integrate them into this. There is still the possibility that I will come across more information in this book that should have been added to this presentation, but I cannot translate it all in 3 days. So ultimately, this video will be posted on the Newman Numismatic portal, and then I will also be sharing it on my own website about bar money, rectanglecoins.com. And if it turns out that there are follow-ups, I will post about it there and send out an email to people who are subscribed to that list with that information as well. So if you want to know if there are any follow-ups, sign up for emails there. The link will be on the last slide here. And just FYI, on any slides that were impacted by things I learned in this book, there's a little oval in the bottom, or an O for October, just so you can see kind of how it's impacted things, which has not been a ton, gratefully. All right, let's dive in. So first of all, one thing that none of the books talked about that I find really interesting is how these were actually manufactured. And so this is a depiction of the mint in Japan at about the time that these were minted. The planchets were actually made by individual craftsmen in their own homes and then brought into the mint and like weighed and verified there. This was only done through Keicho Ichibu. After them, they stopped doing that and all the planchets were made at the mint in an attempt to hide debasement. But for the entire 94-year span of Keicho Ichibu, craftsmen were making the planchets in their own homes and bringing them in. And then they were all struck entirely by hand by men sitting on the floor with a hammer and an anvil. That's what we did. So they're all very handmade. So the first type, as all of the books talked about, we have the old Keicho Ichibu that they were calling old cast. I removed the word cast to remove any confusion about how they were minted. So old Keicho Ichibu. After combing through so many auction records and trying to, figure out trends in pieces that were labeled as old, this is how they are distinguished. The Ichi character is indeed disconnected from the dots. We'll talk about what that means for some other types later. But the Ichi is disconnected. And up here at the top, there are more than 3 dots in both of these corners. Those are the distinguishing factors for the old Keicho Ichibu. Also, just want to point out, this stamp over here, this is not a countermark or anything. This is an official part of the coin. I went down a very deep rabbit hole trying to figure these out in the Gaku Ichibu presentation from a couple years ago. But these were used as a weight verification within the mint. So at some point in the minting process, the planchet was weighed, and if they decided that it was indeed the correct weight, then it was stamped. These were clearly not on every coin, as we'll see a little bit later, but they are very common, and that is not a countermark. That's part of the coin. It can show up on either side. Sometimes they even have 2. I don't know why, but sometimes they do. So just wanted to point that out. So as far as the dots in the corner, there's a wide range of how many there are. As long as it's more than 3, it's old. It can be 4. I think this one is 7 or 6, and then these go all the way across at the top here. I believe, based on the recent book, that the ones with dots going all the way across are believed to be the oldest of the group. They kind of reduced in the number of dots over time. But I don't have any further information on that. I don't think there is any further information on that in the book. It was just a very brief mention of it. So there's that. Also, I have found multiple Gaku overstrikes in both the old Keicho and other types as well. But so these, the mint clearly took a Gaku Ichibu, which for the Gaku Ichibu, this side was basically the same design. It had the same calligraphy, pretty much exactly the same. The other side changed significantly. This is a picture of that side of the Gaku Ichibu. So we have just some calligraphy going down the center that says one bu, and then this triple border with the dots, a solid line, and more dots. That side changed a lot and is the best giveaway for the Gaku overstrikes. You know, you can see on this side that something weird is happening, but this side is really what gives it away, especially if you look at the bottom, you can see dots, a solid line, and dots. The Gaku Ichibu is the only one with a border like that. So we can immediately tell from that that this was originally a Gaku Ichibu that was then restruck as a Keicho. One moment. And this was significant, because until the book I got on Tuesday, I had never seen this talked about anywhere. It was not mentioned even as in passing in any book that I have ever tried to translate from Japanese. There are a lot of pictures of them out on the internet, and I think I found maybe 1 or 2 auctions that pointed it out, but it is not widely discussed. And there has been some speculation over the years of people thinking that the Gaku Ichibu may have been minted later and were not really from 1599 like the literature typically says, which this pretty well disproves. The Keicho Ichibu had to be after the Gaku Ichibu to have been struck over them. So we've pretty well cemented the Gaku Ichibu as predating the Keicho, cementing them in time. We validated their existence. And there are enough of these out there. Like, this is not just a one-off thing. So that was good to know. These are discussed briefly in the book that I found on Tuesday. So then we have the standard Keicho Ichibu, which are the least interesting of the group. These are identified by the Ichi character going through or into the dot border on the side, and then having 3 dots in both of the top corners. Those are the only consistent characteristics across these. There is one other thing that we're going to talk about in just a moment. But there's so much variation in the calligraphy styles, in the flower styles, in everything else about these coins varies so much. If this was an American coin, we would have so many books just breaking down dye varieties and calligraphy styles and all of this, and there just isn't. Even the ones specifically talking about Keicho gold does not break Ichibu down as much as I wish it did. It breaks Koban down that much, but not Ichibu, unfortunately. Anyway, there's a lot of variation, but those 2 characteristics are consistent. So at the very beginning, when we saw the page from Vermeule and Jacobs, they were saying that you have to use whether or not the Ichi goes through the dots to differentiate between Keicho and Kyoho Ichibu. In the entire series of Ichibu, there are 3 types that do not have the character in the top right-hand corner, which are Keicho, Kyoho, and Shotoku. Any book that you find tells you immediately how to differentiate between Shotoku and Kyoho. On Shotoku, the Ichi goes through the dots, and on Kyoho, it's separate. What no book seems to touch on, except Vermeule Jacobs, erroneously, is how to differentiate Shotoku or Kyoho from Keicho. I think this goes back to the focusing on Koban issue, because on the Koban, it's very obvious. They changed the way that some other things were done, and so, like, at a glance, you can separate Keicho from any later Koban. But on the Ichibu, they didn't do that. It didn't have the features that were changed on the Koban. So they are incredibly similar. I have found absolutely nothing actually stating how to differentiate these. So as far as Shotoku and Kyoho go, the Shotoku are significantly rarer, and in my opinion, are easier to confuse with the Keicho Ichibu. So I'm showing a Shotoku here. This applies for both of them. But after going through all of the auction records I can find for Shotoku Ichibu, I found a few different characteristics that you can use to distinguish them. The Shotoku will always have 3 dots in the corner. That's accurate for Kyoho as well. But the main thing, the first thing that I look at when looking at any coin that's been designated as any of these 3 types is the Bu character. On Keicho Ichibu, This stroke on the top right, and then this stroke on kind of the bottom part here are parallel. Whereas on Shotoku and Kyoho, they make a little triangle. I think I've only seen one example of a Keicho Ichibu that made a triangle in the Bu like that. And it was old, so the Ichi was disconnected. But you can tell that it's Keicho because it had more than 3 dots in the corner. This is a much longer discussion to get into, but I just wanted to point out that Bu character is how you can tell the Keicho apart from Shotoku and Kyoho, not the Ichi. The Ichi is just between Shotoku and Kyoho because it's both. Okay, moving on. So, where were they minted? All of the books talk about Kyoto, Suruga, and Edo. What none of the books in English mention is Sado. They were also making them on Sado Island. There was a very significant gold mine in Sado that was operating for a long time. And they started making coinage there during the Keicho minting period. They cannot be distinguished from the other types. There are scrolls from the Sado mint showing the coins that they were making, and there are no distinguishing features on the Ichibu drawings in there. So we have no way of knowing which ones were or were not made in Sado. However, in doing more research, we don't have a way of knowing which ones were made at the other mints either. Historically, there are calligraphy styles that have been attributed to each, but more recently, in any more recent work, it's also stated that there is really no actual historical information backing that up. It's just kind of been passed down, but we cannot prove it. So I have concluded that these are more calligraphy styles that may or may not correlate with a mint, but I don't feel that getting each of them is really necessary to consider yourself to have a complete set. There is some overlap. These are all very distinct examples where I was extremely confident in which one it was. It can be incredibly difficult to tell apart, especially these two. So there's a lot of overlap happening. But in general, for the Edo style calligraphy, we have the 3 dots at the top that are disconnected from the character below, and this kind of looks like a Z. On the Kyoto style, the 3 dots are smaller. The third one kind of fades into this character. This is all one character. I'm calling it 2, but it is all one character. The third one fades into this part of the character, and it is narrower than the coin. There's a significant amount of blank space on either side. And then on the Suruga style, the third dot becomes that next stroke, and the character as a whole is almost as wide as the coin. There's very little room on either side of it. So those are the 3 different mints and the styles of calligraphy that went with them that Hartel did depict and did depict accurately per these observations, just broken down a little bit more specifically. This was a new discovery. You can actually date some Keicho Ichibu a bit more specifically than the full 1601 to 1695 time span. There are some examples that we know were made after the Meireki fire. So the Meireki fire was in 1657 and burnt down 60% of Edo, which is now Tokyo. In doing so, it melted down a lot of the shogun's gold stores. And a lot of that melted gold was then made into coins shortly thereafter. And so the pieces that were made from that melted gold after the Meireki fire, the Bu character has been rotated, which is most distinguishable by it is now kind of in the dot border. This was from the new book, so I have not had a ton of time to compare pieces. There are a lot that to me seem to be kind of intermediate between the 2 types. Here you can see a more normal Bu from one that I believe predates the Meireki fire. I need to do more research and comparison among those different types, but I thought that was interesting and wanted to be sure to include it. So as far as timelines, all we know is that the old Keicho Ichibu started in 1601 and ended sometime before 57. The standard Keicho Ichibu began after 1607 and stopped in 1657. And there was no overlap between these. During this period between 1607 and 1657, there were 2 breaks in manufacturing, and the old Keicho Ichibu stopped before one of the breaks, and then the standard picked up after the break. But I don't know when that break was. I don't think the dates are given in that book. They could be, but I don't think they are. And then we have the ones made after the Meireki fire, which were 1657 to the end in 95. So now we get into the ones that really infuriated me throughout the research. So these, at a glance, this is just a standard Keicho Ichibu. You can see the bu going into the dots here, so it's likely one after the Meireki fire. However, this is actually kind of a sub-variety of the standard Keicho Ichibu that has been mildly repaired. So these pieces were circulating for over 90 years. A lot of them got very worn, got damaged, were, lost some of their gold weight, were just unattractive. And Japan was very proud of their coinage. They wanted the coins in circulation to be a good representation of Japan. So some of those old worn pieces were actually withdrawn from circulation and repaired. Pieces that were just mildly repaired, that were not fully restruck, but maybe were slightly re-engraved to make them a little bit cleaner. Maybe they were treated to make the surfaces look more gold if they'd been worn down. Those can be identified by this very distinct stripy texture on the calligraphy side. They're not super common, but I have found a few in auctions. They're typically not identified in any way. It's clearly not something that Japanese collectors are extremely concerned about, but I thought it was super interesting. And then we get into the single and double hone Keicho Ichibu. So this is the single hone. They're very easy to identify. They have this really weird character in the top right-hand corner. Like I said before, this looks like absolutely no Japanese character that I have ever seen. And it is pure luck that I found what it was and figured out how it came to be. This is an illustration from the beginning of Hartill. It is just meant to show different calligraphy styles in Japanese. And he arbitrarily picked the word Japan to show them. So this is Japan in normal, typed out script. Look at the last one. This character in grass script, which is kind of like cursive Japanese, looks incredibly similar to this. It's like someone took the cursive flowing grass script and then reinterpreted it in a more angular form. And that's how we got this character. So this is actually this, which I certainly could not have told from looking at it without this very helpful illustration from Hartill. So why are we putting the second half of the word Japan on a coin? Well, it's not coming from Japan. First of all, that's not the reason we're using that character. It was actually pulled from this word, which means repaired. These were the pieces that had been so worn down or damaged that they were returned to the mint, and they decided that they needed to fully reheat them and restrike them. They added this character to signify that it had been restruck. That's where it came from. So this name, which was in the books at the beginning, this was the general Japanese term for them, means single hone. This is generally pronounced as hone, not always, but that's what we're going with. Single hone. We got it. This was interesting. In going through auction records, I found multiple examples of pieces that were made from the same die pairing with this gigantic die break on the denomination side, which at the time, this was fairly early in the researching. So this group of pieces is actually what confirmed for me that the pieces with this character were fully restruck and not just modified a little bit with that added on top. But all of the die characteristics across these 3 pieces are the same. Like there's a little chip over here in the die, which is a pretty easy diagnostic to pick out. That's the same across all of them. And then again here, there's a chip going into the border. they're all the same die pairing. So that was very significant for me at the time. I have since found in books confirming that they were fully restruck. At the time I had not. So that's just really interesting. And I do see these come up for auction every now and then. Someone actually just asked me about them one a couple days ago that's currently up for sale. So something neat if you come across. There are others out there. Then there's the double hone. To this day, I have not found anything, even hazarding a guess at why some pieces only have one of these repair marks and others have two. Nothing, which absolutely infuriates me. It's fine. So again, these are very easily distinguishable. I would argue that these are the probably second easiest to distinguish of the entire Gold Ichibu series, because they are the only one with a character in this left-hand corner. None of the others have that. So at a glance, you can tell if this is what's happening. And so as I was going through auction records, these are definitely the rarest of all of the Keicho Ichibu. That became clear very quickly. There are very few auction records out there. And so I, went through and was saving all of the images that I could find and comparing them to each other, and noticed something really weird. So this is just kind of a representative sample. I found maybe twice this number of examples out there, possibly. They're all the same die. Every example that I have found of this, based on everything that I can tell, is the same die, which is incredibly confusing to me. I've circled some of the diagnostics over here that are things I've looked at. There's a little chip here beside this character that you can see pretty clearly in all of these. Looking at like the shape of the space down here, we have a pretty balanced right triangle, and they all have that same shape happening. We have the same distribution of dots down at the bottom. This stroke is very circular, it's not elongated or anything. It's pretty near a perfect circle. Everything seems to match up. And it's easy to look at this coming from like a perspective of US coins and say, yeah, they're consistent. Well, okay, maybe not the die chip so much, but a lot of these things may not be that alarming to a US collector. Of course, the triangle's going to be a similar shape, but that's not the case for these. Okay, here are three of the single hone pieces, which I can only guess were made, in the most similar time frame and situation to the double hone. And just look at the variety across these. This one is an entirely different calligraphy style. This was the Edo Mint style. These two are both the Saruga style of calligraphy, but there are still very obvious differences in them. If you look at the triangle form down here, we have one that's really, really wide, and then one that's really short and squished. There are different numbers of dots happening at the bottom. There's so much variety in these. And these are just three that I pulled out to show you. All of them are so different. The dies were not consistent at this time period in Japan. And so them being that similar, there is just no fathomable way to me that that is not the exact same die. And I have been trying to figure out any explanation for why there would only be one die for that style. This feels like the best lead that I have. This is one example that I have found. Obviously, it's very worn. It's not attractive. Fun side note, it does seem to be a Gaku overstrike. It's certainly an overstrike of something, but the fact that the dot border is so low down here at the top suggests to me it's probably a Gaku overstrike, because there's no reason that a Keicho Ichibu should have dots that far down in the coin. And all of the die characteristics match except for this top left corner. Now, I am not an expert in comparing dies. This is very much just kind of me being shoved into something by necessity. I would love if anyone is more familiar with comparing dies than I am. I just want to know if this is a die break. I don't know if it could be a planchet defect of some sort, some kind of damage or wear, or a die break, because the best theory that I have right now, which is purely conjecture, I would like to make that very clear. It is purely a theory based on this coin. perhaps they originally planned to put the two characters in both corners and found that this corner was unstable when they added that character. If it broke fairly early on, then they said, maybe that's not a good plan, and they took it off and then never put a character in that corner again. Maybe. This is the question that haunts my nightmares about these claims. So I am forever searching for another example that has a corner that looks like this to confirm that it was something with the die and not just this specific example. I have yet to find one. For the record, there are 3 different reverse dies that I have seen with that one. They are most easily distinguished by the number of dots in the lower left-hand corner. If you look at how many are vertical and horizontal, they're all different from each other. So they are pretty quick and easy to tell apart. There are plenty of other things you can look at as well on them, but that is by far the easiest thing to just glance at, and you can see how they're different. So there's that. So this Curie stamps refers to that, neither of those have it, okay. That circular InQs stamp that I pointed out on one of the first pieces that was used as a weight verification for the planchets. They obviously did not put it on all of them. Of the examples that I have seen, these are the percentages that have that stamp that is clearly visible. Sometimes you'll find ones that have a few little stray marks that you're like, well, that may have sometime in the past been a stamp, but you can't really tell. So these are the ones that I can confirm and say confidently have that Curie stamp. The flower on it is called a Curie-mon. So they were pretty consistent among the old and standard, very inconsistent on the single hone, and then the double hone are a little bit higher. I would like to point out that there are so few examples of the double hone that it's less likely that this percentage is representative just because there are so few. And so each one has a lot more weight on that statistics. So I'm not entirely sure what this really signifies, but I thought it was interesting and wanted to include it. So hopefully I'll figure it out someday. As far as chop marks, a lot of the standard Keicho Ichibu are chop marked. A lot of this early gold in general is chop marked. There are some types specifically that over 90% of them have chop marks. It's insane. So from this, we can conclude that, these circulated pretty heavily, whereas the double hone really didn't. This like 9% is probably 1 or 2 pieces that I found that have chop marks at all. So whether that implies that they were not accepted in commerce, that they didn't really get out in commerce, maybe they weren't really officially released, maybe they were made as presentation pieces as opposed to intended for circulation. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but it is interesting. So there's that. As far as value and rarity, there are not numbers on this. This is just meant to compare them to each other. I'm not trying to create a price guide or anything. In fact, all of these are based on auction records from a specific grouping of companies between 2010 and 2019. That's kind of the sample set that I have decided to pull out for data. Ultimately, I plan to write a book on Japanese bar money as a whole and needed to set a time frame for what auction records I want to pull out so I don't have to redo all of the data every time a new auction happens. So 2010 to 19. And so the orange bars show how many of them have come up for auction. So obviously the standard are significantly more common than any of the other types. The yellow bars are the price, and they're also the cheapest. That makes sense. This all looks reasonably balanced. However, if we bring in some of the other rarities of the series, it stops looking quite so balanced. As far as the number of auction appearances, there are the least double hone Keicho Ichibu. Within this 10-year period, I believe there were 8 double hone Keicho Ichibu up for auction at all. The next lowest was 11 with the Sato Ichibu. I mentioned that the Keicho Ichibu were also made in Sato. Later on, Sato did mint Ichibu for 1 year that had a specific character on them. So those are the only ones that are identifiable as Sato Ichibu. So they are a different type and not Keicho at all. And they are considered one of the keys of the series, obviously. Very popular and very expensive, even though they come up for auction a little bit more than the double hone, Keicho Ichibu. And then Gaku Ichibu, which were the very first ones, they're the most distinct, very understandable why they are considered a key. They are also significantly more expensive than the double hone, even though, again, more of them came up for auction. There were the same number of Shotoku Ichibu as there were Gaku, but the pricing for them is on par with the double hone. So based on this, the double hone Keicho Ichibu is really one of the kind of unrecognized rarities of the series, which I just thought was very interesting. Yeah, that's all. As far as remaining questions, I am highly unsatisfied with the current state of this research, and it really bothers me that I haven't been able to figure out why some have the 2 hone characters and others only have 1. That frustrates me no end. I have faith that the answer is out there somewhere and very much hope to find it. On the off chance anyone watching has any leads on that, please let me know. I don't expect there to be any in the English-speaking world, but I would love to be wrong. Also, I would love to know why there was only 1 obverse die used on the double hone Keicho Ichibu, and did it break? What possible circumstance led to that happening? These are 2 that I do not think there is any more information on in the book from Tuesday. As soon as I got access to it, I immediately went through looking for anything related to those repaired pieces with the hone character. There were a few lines and like 3 drawings in the whole book. So I have translated all of the text that seems to relate to them in any way, and none of it has anything to say about either of those questions. None of it even acknowledges that there was only 1 die on the double hone. I haven't seen that published anywhere. So I don't think that the answers to that are in that book, sadly. I was really hoping they would be, but alas. A couple questions that I think may have some information in the book is if there is actually any historical significance to those different calligraphy styles. We had to get them from somewhere, the names and how they were distinguished. So is it possible that they actually related to the mints where the coins were made? Or could they have related to the timing? Maybe some were made earlier and some were later. Is there anything explaining those? Which I think may be discussed in that book, but I have not had time to translate that section, so stay tuned. And then as far as the pieces made in Sato, there is a brief section in the book about Sato, which I have kind of haphazardly translated. And I believe the gist is we can't tell them apart. It may have a little bit more historical information on how and why they were made in Sato and how that came to be. But I'm pretty confident that it does not show how to distinguish them. I truly don't think that that is something that anyone knows. So that one's a lost cause, but I'd love to know more about the history behind the Sato mint. Yes, that's the end. I do have a website. It's rectanglecoins.com. If you want to know more about the series or updates on this presentation. When the Keicho Ichibu stopped in 1695, they were debased for the next pieces, and the Japanese mint was then fighting for the entire rest of its history, with some people wanting to go back to the Keicho standard and others saying that they didn't have the gold stores to do it. There were later returns to that standard, and then it was debased again. The Keicho Ichibu continued to circulate all the way through the end of this pure system of coinage. In 1869, they overhauled the coinage system, or that was the last year of the rectangular pieces. And Keicho Ichibu circulated the entire time. So some of these pieces were in circulation for over 200 years, which is wild to think back on. And some of them look like it. They were pretty high value coins, so they're not something that was changing hands every day. So they did have that going for them. Typically, the ones that are more beat up are just shop marked, all the pieces, as opposed to being circulated. There are ones out there with circulation wear, but the chop marks are really how they show their use more so. So that's the end. Let me take this down. Okay. So then we have some time for the Q&A. I see a few also in here already. So I'm going to work through these, and feel free to go ahead and send other questions in and we'll work through them. Let's see. Okay, yeah, so I'm just going to read this comment off and then ruminate on a little. Rio, which Rio also means both, so I wonder if that actually means the character is at both sides at the top. That would reflect reality. Kata means one side, which also seems to work. So yes, this is going back to the names that were given in like Hartill and the JNDA for the two Hone varieties. The characters used when pronounced are Katamoto and Rio Hone. So the first character would be Kata, and then the second one is Moto. And then for the double Hone, it's Rio Hone. Because of how Japanese works, very confusingly, that second character, even though it's the same character, doesn't sound the same in the two different words. But yes, those first characters do mean single or one side and both. So that's kind of where single and double Hone came from, in an attempt to kind of standardize the naming in a way that makes sense to English-speaking ears. So yes, I agree. Let's see. Okay, yeah. Normally we have a separate facilitator going through the Q&A, so we don't have the awkward pauses as I read through things. So sorry about that. Okay, how long have you been studying these Keicho Ichibu and others? So I started researching the series at large in, I believe, 2019. Yes, I purchased Hartill, which was the first book I got on them in 2019, and kind of fell down the rabbit hole of the Gaku Ichibu in, I believe, early 2020. It may have been late 19. Spent a little, I'm kind of going through them in order from the earliest ones. So I started off focusing on the Gaku Ichibu, spent, I want to say, a little under a year on them. And once I was reasonably content with them, moved on to the Keicho Ichibu, which then took a very long time. I think it was about 2 years that I spent on these off and on. I'm not like sitting down and translating every single evening, but like when I was working on research, it was the Keicho Ichibu for about 2 years, trying to sort out the mess of the different types. So how did you first get interested in the bar money? In early 2019, I was asked by the Newman Numismatic Portal to make a video about weirdly shaped money from around the world. So I was just scouring the internet for any coin that was not a circle, and happened upon a photo of one of the silver pieces of Japanese bar money. And it was the only coin that I had ever seen at that point that was a rectangle with sharp corners. You know, any modern rectangular piece is very rounded, so it doesn't stab you. And these weren't. They were very much more crude and very angular. And I was just immediately intrigued. And I was like, well, I have to have one of these in the video. So I ordered one that was pretty cheap to use in that video, tried to research them. I learned after the fact that some of the things I said in it were actually incorrect because there was no information about them online. There's still very little. Yeah, I tried. But a little while after that, I just was really interested in the series and I wanted to figure it out. So I did a lot of Googling and saw on some forums people were recommending the book by Hartill. So I was like, okay, I'm going to order one more piece and the Hartill book, and then I will know everything I want to know about them. It's not what happened. I got the hardtail book, and it's, like I said, it's my favorite of the references. It is great. It is not without its issues, but of the ones out there, definitely the one that I would recommend. But it did not answer all my questions. I really wanted a lot of historical background on the pieces. I wanted to know why they were rectangles. I wanted to know why the types changed when they did, what prompted them to make a new style. And it did not tell me that. And so I, being stubborn, said, okay, if the book I want doesn't exist, I'm going to write it. And down the rabbit hole I went. So that's how we got here. Okay. Have you considered that the double hone were repaired twice, or that the single die was erroneously made with the hone at the upper left, and then itself repaired by putting the character in the correct upper right location? Interesting. The first had occurred to me that they were repaired twice. That was initially what I thought was happening. When I first learned that that character meant they were repaired, I thought, oh, well, obviously, these have been repaired twice. Then I read books that said, we have no idea why they're different. So I don't know. And that could honestly still be the case. It did not occur to me that it could have been a mistake on the die itself. That's an interesting theory. The Japanese mint was very particular with their coins, especially at this point. They look crude to US collector eyes, but for their technology and what they had at the time, they were putting a lot of care and effort into these coins to make them good and look nice and be consistent. So it's a little hard to believe that they would have let a mistake like that out the door, but they let many of the single hone with that giant die break get out into circulation. So it's not outside the realm of possibility. That's very interesting. I'm gonna have to add that to my list of theories that I hope to someday be able to narrow down. Let me copy that somewhere. Okay. Okay. I have not seen the third book that you showed, the standard catalog. Who is the author and where is it available? It is right here. It's published by Zeus Coin Gallery and Tokyo Ginza. Ooh, my virtual background doesn't like it. There we go. It originally was available on Amazon. I'm not sure if it is presently available for purchase. If you go to my website, the rectanglecoins.com, there is, I think if you go like more and then references, I think that's the path to get there. Research notes and then references, and that lists the different books, and there's a link to where it was on Amazon. I don't know if it's currently in stock. That's the only place that I know of to buy it. It may not be the only one, but that's all I know of. One of the people who worked on it is Clark Smith, who is a US dealer, who I've met at the ANA. So you'll see him around sometimes, but he worked on this with a few people from Japan whose names I don't know. Yeah, Zeus Coin Gallery is the author cited. It doesn't cite an individual. So yeah. Okay, I think that is all that is currently in the Q&A here. I'm copying one other thing out. Okay. Cool. Good deal. Okay, so there isn't anything else in the Q&A. So if you have any last minute questions, feel free to go ahead and send them and we'll come back to it. Otherwise, that's going to wrap us up. Thank you so much for joining us and me today. It's very much appreciated. We will be back at 11 a.m. Eastern tomorrow with Amal A. Warwick with King Edward the 7th, King Edward the 7th 1 rupee coins. Roman numerals are not my strong suit. So hope you all will tune in to that one. We'll be here throughout the day as well with some other topics. So thank you all for joining. Have a good evening.